The text on Emily's phone was 3 words she hadn't expected to survive reading. "If you still want me, come." She stared at it until her vision blurred. 2 hours. 2 hours before she was supposed to walk down that aisle and become Mrs. Nathan Holloway, and the only person she'd contacted was the man who'd disappeared from her life without a single word 7 years ago. Her hands were shaking. She pressed send before she could stop herself. The reply came in under 40 seconds. "Lock the door. Don't trust anyone. I'm already here." If you've ever felt completely trapped by someone who was supposed to love you, stay with me because this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel. Follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Emily Carter had spent 31 days planning the seating arrangements alone. 31 days, deciding which judge sat nearest the windows, which city councilman needed to be kept away from which senator's aide, which of Nathan's law partners required the imported champagne instead of the domestic label, because Nathan had explained patiently the way he explained everything, like she was a child who needed things repeated, that appearances at an event like this were not decorative. They were strategic. Every detail of this wedding was a business decision wrapped in white tulle, and Emily had understood that clearly for months. What she hadn't understood until 47 minutes ago was that she was one of the decorations. She was sitting on the edge of the fainting couch in the bridal suite of the Beaumont estate, still in her robe, her hair pinned in the preliminary style her stylist had constructed before stepping out for 15 minutes. The dress hung on the wardrobe door behind her $12,000 of ivory silk, with a cathedral-length train that had required its own travel case. She hadn't put it on yet. She wasn't sure she could. Her phone lay face up on the cushion beside her. Nathan's text was still on the screen. "Smile today, or your father's company disappears tomorrow." That was it. No greeting. No punctuation at the end, as though the threat didn't even merit a period. She'd read it 6 times, and each time she read it the room felt smaller. The suite was enormous original crown molding 3 windows overlooking the garden, where 240 guests were already beginning to gather, and it felt like a closet. It felt like a room with no exits. She'd known Nathan Holloway was controlling. She'd told herself that was just how powerful men operated. She'd told herself it was protection structure, the price of being loved by someone with that much at stake. She'd told herself a lot of things over 2 years that she would spend a long time unlearning. But she had never seen it written out that plainly. "Smile today, or your father's company disappears tomorrow." Not a request, not even a warning, a schedule. She picked up her phone, and she did something she hadn't planned to do. She didn't call her mother. She didn't call her best friend Dara, who was somewhere downstairs adjusting her bridesmaid dress and sampling the canapes. She didn't call her father, who had spent 30 years building Carter Construction from a 2-man crew into a company that employed over 300 people across 4 parishes. She opened a contact she had never deleted. She'd moved phones twice in 7 years. Both times, she had transferred the contact manually, which was something she had never examined too closely, because examining it would have required admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. Vincent Moretti. The contact photo was 7 years old, a candid she'd taken on a Thursday afternoon when he was laughing at something she'd said, and didn't know she was taking the picture. He looked young in it. He looked happy. She barely remembered the version of herself who had taken that photo, but she remembered him. She had spent 7 years trying to stop remembering him, and she had never once succeeded. She typed 4 words. "If you still want me." Then she stopped. Her thumbs hovered over the screen. Downstairs, she could hear the string quartet warming up. She could hear the low murmur of arriving guests, the coordinated sounds of a celebration that had been designed down to the minute. Nathan had hired an event coordinator who had produced an actual printed timeline, laminated, distributed to every vendor. Emily had one in the suite. It was on the vanity table next to her earrings. She didn't need to look at it to know what it said. 11:00 a.m. bride prepares for processional. It was 10:23. She finished the sentence. "If you still want me, come." She sent it before she could talk herself out of it. Then she sat very still, waiting for the regret to arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was a hollow ringing silence in her chest, like the space a held breath leaves behind. The reply came in under 40 seconds. Lock the door. Don't trust anyone. I'm already here. Emily read it 3 times. Then she stood up, crossed the room, and turned the deadbolt on the suite door with a click that sounded very loud in the silence. She pressed her back against the door and slid down until she was sitting on the floor in her robe, holding her phone with both hands. And for the first time in 2 years, she felt something she hadn't been able to name. Not safe. Not rescued. Just less alone. That was when the first knock came. Emily. Her mother's voice, gentle and distracted, the way Margaret Carter always sounded at large events, present in body, half occupied with logistics. The stylist is asking if she should come back up. We're running a little behind. Emily looked at the deadbolt. Give me 15 minutes, Mom. Sweetheart, we really don't have 15 minutes. A pause. All right, I'll tell her 20. Footsteps retreating down the hall. Emily let out a breath. She pulled herself up off the floor, because sitting on the floor of a bridal suite in a robe was not going to help her think, and walked to the window that overlooked the rear garden. From here she could see the rows of white draped chairs already filling with guests. She could see the arch at the far end, wound through with gardenias and eucalyptus, the thing she had spent 6 weeks selecting with a florist Nathan had chosen. She could see the path she was supposed to walk in 97 minutes. She saw none of it really. What she saw was a memory she couldn't shake. 3 weeks ago, she'd been at her desk in the small home office Nathan tolerated because it made her feel useful. Those were words she'd never said to anyone, but occasionally thought, and she'd been going through files for a charity benefit her mother was organizing. She'd needed a specific invoice routed incorrectly to her personal email account, and in searching for it, she had opened the wrong attachment. She'd sat with it open for a long time before she understood what she was looking at. A wire transfer. Then another. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth. A chain of transfers moving money through shell companies linked to Nathan's law firm, routed through accounts in 3 states and 1 offshore jurisdiction. She wasn't a forensic accountant. She didn't know exactly what the documents represented. But she knew what hidden money looked like because her father had once shown her what fraud looked like when a subcontractor had tried it on one of his projects. And this looked exactly like that, but scaled in a way that made her stomach drop. She'd closed the attachment. She'd sat there for a long time. Then she'd gone to find Nathan. She'd found him in the study on the phone, laughing at something the person on the other end had said. He'd held up one finger, the gesture that meant, "I'll be a moment," and she'd waited. And when he ended the call and looked at her with that composed, slightly distant smile he'd perfected for every occasion, she'd said very quietly, "I think I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." He'd looked at her for a moment. Then he'd said, "Why don't we sit down?" And everything after that had been perfectly calm, which was the most frightening part. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't threatened, not directly. He'd simply explained in the same measured voice he used in depositions that her father's company held 3 contracts that existed only because Nathan had made certain phone calls. That her mother's charity maintained its non-profit status through a filing process that Nathan's firm managed. That Dara's boutique had survived a lease dispute 2 years ago because Nathan had spoken to the right landlord. He'd said all of this while offering her a glass of water, as though hospitality and coercion could occupy the same breath, and by the time he finished, she understood that she had not been building a life with him. She had been building a cage one quiet favor at a time, and she had not noticed because the cage had been comfortable. "I love you," he'd said at the end. "This marriage is what's best for both of us, for everyone." She hadn't argued. She'd taken the water. She'd gone back to her office and sat very still, and she'd started quietly to think. That was 3 weeks ago. She was still thinking. Except now she had 40 minutes before she needed to go downstairs, and Vincent Moretti had just told her he was already here, and she had no idea what that meant. Her phone buzzed again. Not Nathan this time. A number she didn't recognize. A single line of text. Suite 4. Roof access. 5 minutes. Come alone, or don't come. She stared at it. Then she put on her shoes. Suite 4 was at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway, past the family rooms Nathan had reserved for his partners and their spouses. The door was ajar. She pushed it open slowly and stepped inside, and for one disorienting moment, the room appeared to be empty. Then a man stepped out from beside the wardrobe, and her knees nearly went out from under her. He was taller than she remembered. Or maybe she'd just spent 7 years flattening him in her memory, reducing him to something manageable. His hair was darker, cut short, in a way that was entirely different from the way he'd worn it when they were 22, and he was working construction sites and coming to her door on Friday evenings, with dirt still under his fingernails, and a smile that made her forget every reasonable thing she'd ever planned for herself. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie. His hands were in his pockets, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, which was new. She used to be able to read every expression Vincent Moretti had. "Emily," he said. Just her name. That was all. And she did something she hadn't expected, which was that she walked across the room and hit him in the chest with both palms, not hard enough to matter, but hard enough to make her feel something solid. 7 years, she said. "You didn't call. You didn't. There was nothing. I thought you were dead, Vincent. For the first 6 months, I genuinely thought you were dead, because that was the only explanation that made any sense." He absorbed the impact without stepping back. He looked at her with something that might have been grief, or might have been relief, or might have been both. They occupied the same territory sometimes. "I know," he said. "That's not an explanation." "No," he agreed. "It's not." "Then give me one." "Not yet." He said it without apology. "Right now, I need to know something first." His eyes moved to her face with a focus that she'd forgotten the way he used to look at her, like she was the only surface worth looking at in any room. "That text, did you send it because you needed to get out, or because you wanted to reach me?" Emily opened her mouth, closed it. That was, she thought, an extraordinarily unfair question, because the honest answer was both, and she hadn't fully admitted that to herself until this exact moment. "Does it matter?" she asked. "It matters to me." She looked at him. 7 years. 2 years with Nathan. 1,000 mornings of waking up in a life that had seemed in daylight, like the right life, organized, respectable, secure, and that had crumbled into something unrecognizable in the space of a single opened attachment. "Both," she said. It was both. Something shifted in his face. He didn't smile. It wasn't that, but something opened up that had been closed. "All right," he said. "Then here's what I need you to know." What he told her, standing in that room with the muffled sounds of the wedding preparation drifting up from below, was not everything. She understood that even as he was saying it. He was giving her a specific shape of information, enough to explain the text, enough to explain why he was here, not enough to account for 7 years in a single conversation. He told her that Nathan Holloway's law firm was under federal investigation, had been for 14 months. That the financial structures she'd glimpsed in those documents were the surface layer of something considerably deeper. Money moved on behalf of clients who were not the kind of clients who appeared in the firm's official letterhead. He told her that Nathan knew about the investigation, had known for months, and that the marriage was not incidental to his strategy for surviving it. "You're credible," Vincent said. "Your family is well regarded. Nathan is building a narrative, respected attorney, devoted husband, pillar of the community. He's planning to use your name as insulation." Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. "He's going to let me stand next to him while he's already doing it. The engagement has been public for 8 months. The wedding photos will be everywhere by tonight." He paused. "He needs the image more than he needs the marriage. He threatened my father's company this morning." She said it flatly because flat was the only register she could manage right now. In a text. 37 words. Vincent's expression didn't change, but something in his jaw tightened. "I know." "How do you know?" "I've been watching." That should have frightened her. She thought about whether it frightened her, standing there in that room with a man she hadn't spoken to in 7 years, who had apparently been monitoring her life from an undisclosed distance, and she found that what she felt was not fear. She felt fury. "That's something we're going to talk about," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are." "Not right now." "No," he agreed. "Not right now." She turned toward the window. Through it, she could see the edge of the garden, the white chairs, the distant shape of the floral arch. She thought about her father, who had called her last week to say, voice thick with something she'd recognized as suppressed worry, that he was glad she was happy. She thought about her mother, who had cried at the dress fitting, and then laughed and said it was just relief. Emily had always worried, her mother always been the one who made choices that Margaret Carter couldn't quite predict or control. She thought about Dara, who was her oldest friend, and had said when Emily announced the engagement, "He's not what I expected for you," and had never elaborated, and Emily had never pushed. She thought about 31 days of seating arrangements. "If I don't go through with it," she said slowly, "he destroys everything he mentioned. My father's contracts, my mother's charity filing, Dara's lease." "Possibly," Vincent said. "He'd try. And if I do go through with it, he uses you for as long as the investigation runs. Could be a year, could be more. And at the end of it, when the indictment comes, and it's coming. Emily, the federal timeline is not in his control, no matter what he believes. You're standing next to him in every photograph." She turned back to him. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked. "Because I need to be very specific about what I'm agreeing to here." "A way out," he said. "Today, with your family intact." "How?" "That's what I need a few hours to put together. But I need you to buy us time." He looked at her steadily. "Can you go downstairs? Go through the preparations. Let them put on the dress. Walk to the point of no return, not past it. Just to it. Can you do that?" Emily thought about it. "You're asking me to perform the entire wedding," she said. "I'm asking you to delay it." "There's a difference." "Yes," he said. "There is." She studied him. He looked back at her without flinching, and she remembered suddenly and completely that this had always been his quality, the absolute stillness under pressure. She had once found it calming. Right now, she found it infuriating because calm was not what this situation called for. But he was not wrong. "Fine," she said. "But when this is over, you tell me everything, starting with why you left." "Everything," he said. "I promise you." She turned to go. His voice stopped her. "Emily." She looked back. "I know I don't have the right to say this," he said. "But I need to say it. I never stopped." He paused, started again. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For the way I left. For the years. I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. "Don't apologize yet," she said. "You haven't explained anything." She opened the door. "Apologize when I understand." She went back to the bridal suite. She let the stylist back in. She sat in the chair and watched her own reflection while her hair was finished and her makeup was applied the full effect, the wedding day transformation, and she kept her face very still and thought about what Vincent had told her, sorting through it, the way her father had once taught her to sort through structural plans, finding the load-bearing elements, identifying what could fail. Her mother came in at 10:50, already pink with excitement, and the particular anxiety of a mother who has been planning this day for 2 years. "You look beautiful," Margaret said. "Thank you, Mom." "Are you nervous? You look—" Her mother tilted her head. "You look very calm." "I'm calm," Emily said. "Nathan sent up these." Her mother held out a small box, Cartier cream-colored expensive. "He said they were his grandmother's." Emily took the box, opened it. Inside, on a bed of white satin, were diamond earrings that caught the light like something calculated. She closed the box, set it down. "I'll wear my own," she said. Her mother blinked. "He'll notice." "I know." A pause. Her mother looked at her with the particular expression she'd been deploying since Emily was a teenager, the one that meant, "I see something I'm not sure I should ask about." "Emily," she said carefully, "are you happy?" The question was so enormous and so simple that Emily had to take a breath before she could answer it. "Ask me tonight," she said. Dara came in at 11:15, resplendent in the dusty rose bridesmaid dress that she'd privately called the color of a dying flamingo, but had worn without complaint. She took one look at Emily standing in the full-dress cathedral train arranged by the stylist in a careful arc, and her eyes went bright. "Oh," she said softly. "Em, don't cry. Your makeup is perfect." "I'm not crying." Dara was absolutely crying. "You look... Don't." "Okay." Dara fanned her face, composed herself. Then, in a different register, quieter, more careful. "Are you okay?" Emily looked at her oldest friend in the mirror. "I need you to listen to me," she said. "And I need you to not ask questions right now because we don't have time, and I'll explain everything later. Okay?" Dara went still. "Okay. If something unexpected happens downstairs." "What kind of unexpected?" Dara. "Right. No questions. Okay." "If something unexpected happens," Emily continued, "I need you to stay with my mother. Don't let her go anywhere alone. Keep her calm. Can you do that?" Dara studied her. "Is Nathan?" Dara. "Right, yes, I can do that." She paused. "Em, are you?" "I'm going to be fine," Emily said. "I think. I'm working on it." Dara opened her mouth, closed it. Then she crossed the room and put her arms around Emily from behind, careful of the dress, her chin on Emily's shoulder, both of them looking at their reflections. "Whatever happens," Dara said quietly, "I'm on your side. I've always been on your side. You know that, right?" Emily covered Dara's hands with her own. "I know," she said. Nathan was at the bottom of the main staircase when Emily descended, a position she understood immediately was not accidental. He was standing precisely where the first guests would see him, where the photographers would capture the moment, where the image of the devoted groom receiving his bride would be composed without any effort at all. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his expression when he saw her was exactly what a wedding photograph required. Open, warm, handsome in the practiced way of men who had spent their careers managing how they were perceived. He took her hand. His fingers were cool. "You look perfect," he said. "Thank you. I'm glad you made the right choice this morning." She looked at him. His smile didn't waver. It was a smile that had been refined through years of courtrooms and donor dinners. A smile that communicated absolutely nothing about what was happening behind his eyes. "I did," she said. "Make a choice this morning." Something crossed his face. A very small thing, barely visible. "Good." He turned to acknowledge a passing guest, and in the 2 seconds his attention shifted, Emily let herself look at him fully, not as the man she'd been engaged to, not as the threat he'd revealed himself to be, but as a stranger. Which was, she realized, what he had always been. She had chosen the version of him she could live with. She had been choosing it for 2 years. She was done choosing it. The procession formed at 11:45. The bridesmaids went first. Dara among them, catching Emily's eye once as she took her position, a look that said, "I see you, and I'm here." Then the ushers, then the flower girl, a distant niece of Nathan's, who was 4 years old and deeply uncertain about her responsibilities. Then the ring bearer. Then the coordinator materialized at Emily's elbow, pressing a small earpiece into her own ear and checking something on her tablet. "We're right on schedule," she said. "The guests are seated. The officiant is in position." She looked at Emily. "Ready." Emily could hear the string quartet shifting into the processional. She could hear 240 people falling into expectant silence. She thought about her father, who was going to take her arm in 30 seconds and walk her through those doors. Who didn't know any of it. Who had spent 30 years building something that someone had quietly leveraged as a weapon without his knowledge. She thought about Vincent somewhere out there asking for a few hours. She thought about what it meant to walk to the point of no return. Not past it, he'd said. Just to it. She looked at the coordinator. "Ready," she said. Her father was waiting. Robert Carter, at 62, was a broad man, a physical man who had spent decades on job sites before the business grew large enough to keep him behind a desk, and he had never entirely abandoned the quality of presence that came from years of being the person who arrived and made things happen. When he took Emily's arm, his grip was solid. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" he said quietly. "I'm okay, Dad." "Nervous." A little. He patted her hand. That's normal. That's how it's supposed to feel. He paused. You're sure about this? About him. Emily looked at her father's face, the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the steady, capable expression of a man who had never once in his life tried to be anything other than exactly what he was. She thought about telling him. Right now. Right here in the 30 seconds before the doors opened. She thought about what Vincent had said. Buy us time. I love you, Dad, she said. He smiled. I love you too, sweetheart. More than anything. The doors opened, and Emily Carter walked forward into an event that had never been a wedding toward a man who had never been a groom through a future she was going to have to rebuild from scratch. But not alone. Outside, through the tall windows of the Beaumont Estates grand ballroom, over the white-draped chairs and the perfect floral arch, and the 240 people who were watching her walk, she heard it. The low, heavy percussion of rotor blades. Distant at first, then not distant at all. Several guests turned their heads. Someone near the back murmured something. The string quartet faltered, a single dropped note quickly recovered, and the coordinator's voice crackled in her earpiece with something Emily couldn't hear clearly over the sound that was now filling the entire room. Nathan heard it too. She could tell by the way his expression changed the smallest fracture in the composure, the first thing she had ever seen him fail to control. He looked up. Through the high windows, very clear now, against the cloudless Louisiana sky, a black helicopter banked in a low arc over the Beaumont estate and began to descend. The helicopter didn't land. Not yet. It held position above the estate, low enough that the rotor wash bent the flower arrangements on the nearest tables, low enough that conversation became impossible, low enough that 240 people stopped pretending they were focused on the ceremony and turned their faces upward like they were watching something they couldn't name but couldn't look away from. Nathan's smile had not recovered. Emily watched it happen in real time, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes moved to the windows and stayed there a beat too long, the way his hand, which had been resting at his side in the relaxed posture of a man entirely in command of his surroundings, curled once into a fist and then uncurled. He covered it immediately. By the time the nearest guests glanced at him, his expression had been rebuilt. But Emily had seen it. 4 seconds of unguarded Nathan Holloway, and what she'd seen underneath the architecture of his composure was not anger. It was recognition. I knew what that helicopter meant, which meant he knew who was in it, which meant there was a great deal more happening than she had been told by either of them. She kept walking. Her father's arm was solid under her hand, and she used that solidity the way she'd used handrails on scaffolding as a child when her father brought her to job sites, not because she needed it to stand, but because knowing it was there allowed her to look out instead of down. She kept her face arranged in something that she hoped read as bridal nerves. She kept her eyes forward. She did not look up at the windows again. The officiant, a distinguished man in his 60s, whom Nathan had selected like everything else with precision, cleared his throat and raised his voice over the fading percussion of the helicopter, which was pulling back, now rising slightly, settling into a holding pattern that was somehow worse than landing because it meant, I'm not leaving. If everyone could please redirect their attention, he said, and people did the way people at formal events always redirect attention when asked by someone in authority, filing their curiosity away for the reception conversations they were already composing. Emily reached the altar. Nathan took her hand. His grip was different from her father's. Precise where her father's was solid, controlled where her father's was warm. She had held this hand for 2 years, and she was only now understanding the difference between a grip that steadied you and a grip that simply kept you in place. You're doing perfectly, Nathan said quietly, just for her. The officiant was welcoming the guests, buying them a few seconds of privacy inside the public event. I know, Emily said. Good. He tilted his head very slightly. That helicopter is nothing, a nuisance. It'll be dealt with. I'm sure it will, she said. He looked at her for a beat longer than necessary. Then the officiant turned to them, and Nathan's attention went forward, and Emily stood beside the man she was not going to marry, and listened to words she was not going to let reach their conclusion, and she thought about Vincent Moretti, standing in Suite 4, telling her he'd been watching. She thought about the 7 years between the boy she'd loved and the man upstairs in the suit. She thought about how a person became one from the other, and she went back the way the mind goes back when the present becomes unlivable to the beginning. She had been 22 when she first met Vincent, and the circumstances were so ordinary that she'd told the story exactly once in the years since to Dara. Late at night, a bottle of wine between them, because ordinary beginnings felt insufficient for the size of what had followed. Her father had been building a commercial project on the north side of the city. Emily had just graduated and was working in the company's administrative offices, while she figured out what she actually wanted to do with her life, which was something she would not figure out for several more years, and which her mother had begun to discuss with escalating frequency. She'd been dropping off payroll documents at the site, a task she'd volunteered for specifically because it got her out of the office, and she'd turned a corner and nearly walked into a man carrying an armful of copper pipe. He'd grabbed her arm to keep her from falling. The pipe had clattered across the concrete. "Sorry," he'd said immediately. "I didn't see you." "I didn't see you either," she'd said. "So that's even." He'd laughed. And that had been it. That had been the beginning of everything, in the way that laugh and that exact moment of mutual clumsiness had introduced her to someone who would take up permanent residence in the space behind her ribs. His name was Vincent Moretti. He was 23. He'd grown up in the system foster care, one placement after another. Nothing stable enough to call home, and he'd learned construction because a foster father in his early teens had been a contractor who treated the craft like a calling, and who was. Vincent had told her once the only adult before the age of 18 who had ever looked at him like he was worth the attention. He'd been working for Carter Construction for 8 months. He was good at his job. He was good at most things he decided to put his hands on, which Emily had observed in the ensuing months, with the particular attention of someone who was trying very hard to convince herself she wasn't paying special attention. They'd become friends first. That had been real. She wanted to be clear about that in the version of the story she told herself. The friendship had been genuine before it became anything else built on lunch breaks, where he explained load-bearing calculations, and she explained contract law on Friday evenings, when a group from the site went to a bar on Magazine Street and stayed too late on one Sunday afternoon when they'd ended up at the Ogden Museum entirely by accident and spent 3 hours in front of paintings they hadn't planned to see talking about things that had nothing to do with construction or contracts. She'd fallen in love with him somewhere in those 3 hours. She hadn't known it was happening until it had already happened, which was the most honest thing she could say about it. They'd been together for 14 months when he disappeared. No fight, no warning, no scene from which an ending could be inferred. One evening, dinner at her apartment, laughing at something on television, his hand warm on the back of her neck, and the next morning, he was simply gone. His number disconnected, his apartment cleared out, his locker at the site emptied. Her father, who had known Vincent and liked him, had made inquiries. There was nothing to find. People didn't leave traces they didn't want to leave, and Vincent had left none. She had spent 6 months in something that she recognized now as grief, though she hadn't named it that at the time. Then she'd spent another year being angry, which was more useful. Then she'd spent 2 years being fine, which was the most exhausting of the three. Then Nathan Holloway had appeared at a charity gala her mother organized, and he'd been exactly what a person looked like when they had decided to be something polished, attentive, capable of making any room feel like it existed specifically for the conversation he was having in it. He'd asked for her number. She'd given it, and she'd been aware giving it that she was choosing something. Not him specifically. The choice to stop being fine and start being someone who was actually building a life, a real, legible, stable life, with a future that had shape and direction. She had chosen Nathan the way you choose a road, because it's paved and the other one isn't, and for a while, that had been enough. For a while, the officiant was speaking. She heard his words in the way you hear things when you're very far inside your own head. The sounds arrived, the meaning processed partially like a radio in another room. And then he said something that her mind caught like a hook. If anyone present knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage. The room went very still. Emily felt Nathan's hand tighten on hers, and then the sound came back. Not the helicopter this time. Something else. A low, resonant vibration, different from rotor blades building from below, rather than above. And several guests turned toward the main entrance, and the double doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and the coordinator who had been stationed near the entrance with her tablet and her earpiece and her laminated timeline stepped back involuntarily. A man walked in. He walked the way. Vincent Moretti had always walked, not quickly, not slowly, but with a kind of irreducible purpose that made the pace irrelevant. He was in the dark suit, no tie, the same as he'd been in Suite 4. He didn't look at the guests. He didn't look at the officiant. He looked at Emily with an expression that she could now read clearly because she was no longer trying not to read it. It was an apology. It was 14 months of love and 7 years of absence, and whatever had happened in between compressed into a single look that crossed a ballroom full of people in formal wear and landed on her with the force of something she wasn't ready for. "Stop," Nathan said. His voice was low, but it carried. "Someone stop him." 2 of Nathan's security staff moved from their positions near the side doors. Neither of them reached Vincent. The first one stopped when Vincent looked at him, not a threatening look, just a look, the look of a man who has been in rooms considerably more dangerous than this one, and would like you to understand that he knows the difference. The second one got close enough that Emily held her breath. Vincent spoke to him quietly, 3 words she couldn't hear. The security man stepped back. Nathan's hand on Emily's was now a grip. "Let go of me," she said quietly. "Emily." His voice was a warning wrapped in pleasantness. "Let go." He released her hand. A political calculation, causing a scene here now on camera, in front of judges and city councilmen, and 240 witnesses, was not the calculation. She saw him making it. She saw the whole machine of his mind working through the variables in real time, and she understood that this was what she'd been living beside for 2 years. Not a person exactly, but a process. Vincent stopped 6 feet from the altar. He looked at Emily. Then he looked at Nathan. Then very calmly he said, "I think she deserves to make this choice without the weight of your threats in the room." Nathan's voice dropped an octave. "You have no idea what you're involving yourself in." 11 years, Vincent said. "I know exactly what I'm involving myself in." The room was absolutely silent. Nathan looked at Emily. The warmth in his expression had not disappeared. It had inverted, become something that wore the shape of warmth and was made of entirely different material. "This is your moment," he said softly. "Whatever you decide right now, and everything that follows is yours to carry." Emily looked at him. She thought about her father's contracts, her mother's charity filing, Dara's lease. She thought about 31 days of seating arrangements. She thought about a man she had spent 7 years trying to forget, who had apparently spent 7 years making sure she was safe. She thought about the text, "Smile today, or your father's company disappears tomorrow." And she thought, that's not love. That's never been love. I've been standing inside someone's strategy and calling it a relationship. She looked at Vincent. "You said you weren't here to take me away," she said loud enough for the room to hear. "You said you were asking if this was my choice." "Yes," he said. "Is this a better choice?" she asked. Honestly, he looked at her steadily. "I can't answer that," he said. "It's your life. I can tell you what I know about this one." A pause. "I can tell you I know enough." "That's not enough of an answer." "No," he said. "It isn't." Something in her chest shifted. "No," she said. Nathan's head turned toward her. "No," she said again louder. "I don't want to marry him." And the room came apart. Not dramatically. Not the way a movie would play it with gasps and tears and people rising from their seats. Reality was messier and faster and louder than that. There were voices overlapping Nathan's name being said by several people simultaneously. The officiant beginning a sentence, he wasn't sure how to finish one of Nathan's law partners getting to his feet near the 3rd row. Nathan himself was very still for exactly 3 seconds, which was how long it took him to make another calculation. And then he turned to the nearest bank of guests, with his hands open, and his expression reconstructed into something sorrowful, and composed, and devastatingly sympathetic, and said loud enough to reach the room, "I think we all just witnessed someone in a great deal of distress." Emily felt the calculation like a physical thing. He's already controlling the narrative. The story was being written in real time. Unstable bride concern from loving groom, unfortunate public spectacle. In 4 hours that narrative would be in every ear in this room, and from those ears it would travel. "I am not in distress," she said clearly. "I am making a decision." "Emily." Nathan's voice was gentle, heartbreaking if you didn't know the machinery behind it. You don't have to do this here. You said I had to decide right now, she said. This morning you said decide now. This is me deciding, right now. Something flickered in his eyes. The calculation adjusted. He looked at Vincent, and for a moment the two men looked at each other across 6 feet of white-carpeted aisle, and Emily saw something pass between them. Not words, not even quite threat, but a kind of mutual acknowledgement. I know what you are. You know what I am. This is real. You'll regret this, Nathan said. Not loudly, not to the room, directly to her in the voice she'd heard once when she'd tried to cancel a dinner reservation. He'd already confirmed, small and certain and final. Everything I mentioned this morning, every single thing. You should know, she said, that a man I trust has spent 14 months looking at your financial records. So you might want to think carefully before you start making calls today. She had no idea if that was true. She had no idea what Vincent knew exactly, or when he'd known it, or what 14 months referred to. But she'd seen Nathan's face when the helicopter appeared, and she'd heard the recognition in it, and she was making a bet. The bet landed. Nathan went absolutely still. It wasn't the stillness of composure. It was the stillness of a man who has just learned that the ground he thought was solid has a cavity underneath it, and he is trying to calculate how much weight it can hold before deciding whether to step. I want to leave now, Emily said to Vincent, clearly, in her own voice. Then let's go, he said. They walked out through the main entrance, and the doors closed behind them, and the coordinator was standing there with her tablet and her laminated timeline, and an expression Emily was fairly sure she had never used in a professional context before, and Emily said, I'm so sorry about all of this. The catering has been fully paid. Please make sure the guests are taken care of. The coordinator blinked. Ah yes, of course. The flowers can go to a senior center. The coordinator can advise. There's one on Prytania. Right. Another blink. Thank you for your work, Emily said. It was genuinely beautiful. Then she walked out into the Louisiana morning in her $12,000 dress with a man she hadn't spoken to in 7 years, and she felt not triumph, not relief, but the particular hollow feeling of a decision made solid, irreversible, and too large to understand yet. A car was waiting. She didn't ask whose. She got in. They drove in silence for 4 minutes. Then she said, Why did you leave? How was quiet long enough that she thought he was organizing something. Finding the right beginning, the right words, the structure that would make it make sense. She'd given him an opening a year ago. She hadn't actually given him. She'd told him not to apologize until he explained. He was apparently taking that seriously. There were people, he said finally, who decided that the easiest way to reach someone was through whatever they loved. She turned toward him. I was 23, and I had no money, and no family, and no leverage over anyone, he continued. What I had was you. And the people I'm talking about, they knew what I had. They made it very clear that continuing to have you was contingent on a choice. What choice? Leave everything. Leave New Orleans. Leave you. Disappear and stay disappeared and do something useful for the people asking. Or they would take you to make the point. The car was quiet. What people, she said. An organization that controlled several construction contracts in the city, including some of your father's. He glanced at her. They'd been watching the company, watching the people around it. They saw me, and they made a calculation that I was the soft point, that I could be used. Used to do what? To start with nothing. Disappear, stay disappeared and be available. That was the initial ask. He paused. It escalated. Over time it escalated. And you chose to do it. I chose to make sure you never had to think about any of it, he said. Yes. Emily absorbed that. She was aware that she was supposed to feel something gratitude perhaps, or vindication. The sense of a mystery finally solved. What she actually felt was something considerably more complicated, because the thing he was describing was a sacrifice made without consultation, and the difference between protection and control was a question she was going to need time to answer. How long, she asked. 3 years to dismantle them. They weren't the only organization in that space. It required building something of my own resources, relationships, leverage. To fight that kind of thing, you have to be able to stand in the same rooms. You built a criminal organization, she said. I built a security operation, he said. The line between those things is real, even when it doesn't look like it from outside. And the whole time, I knew where you were, he said. Yes, you watched me. I made sure you were safe. Those are the same sentence, Vincent. He didn't argue. That she thought was the first point in his favor. He didn't try to convince her that surveillance and protection occupied different categories when she'd just drawn a clear line between them. "And Nathan?" she asked. A pause that was almost a breath. "When did you know about Nathan?" she pressed. "When you started dating him," he said. 14 months ago, I started seeing his financial structure. I was in rooms where his name came up in ways it shouldn't have been coming up." He looked at her. "I couldn't come to you directly. You would have had every right to tell me to disappear permanently. You could have tried." "Yes," he said. "I could have. That's one of the things I'm going to spend a long time answering for." She turned to look out the window. The city moved past New Orleans in morning light, ordinary and beautiful and indifferent to the specific catastrophe of any given day. "So for the past 14 months, she said slowly, "while I was planning a wedding, you were watching a federal investigation unfold around my fiancé." "Yes, and you waited until this morning." "I waited until I had enough to ensure that whatever happened today, Nathan couldn't follow through on his threats. The financial documentation I've been building, not alone, but I've contributed significantly, is with federal investigators as of last Thursday. He can threaten your father's contracts. He cannot deliver on those threats. The leverage is gone." She turned back to him sharply. "As of last Thursday?" "Yes. 4 days ago?" "Yes. And this morning was." "The timing was his. He sent that text. He moved the timeline. I had to move with it." She stared at him. Something that might have been admiration and might have been fury was occupying the same space in her chest, which was a combination she had never experienced before and did not entirely know what to do with. "You coordinated all of this," she said, "and you did not tell me. I was trying to protect." "Stop," she said. "I know that sentence. I know exactly where it ends. And I need you to hear me, Vincent, because I'm going to say this once clearly. Nathan said almost exactly those words to me. Different situation. Same mechanism. You don't get to decide what I need protection from. I'm not a position to be defended. I am a person." Silence. "Then you're right. I know I'm right. I'm sorry." "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." She looked at him for a long moment. 7 years in his face, the lines that hadn't been there before, the stillness that had deepened the quality of someone who had spent a long time in difficult rooms, making difficult decisions, and carrying the weight of both. He looked like a man who had survived things she didn't fully know the shape of, and he looked like the person she had known at 22, and those two things were somehow both true simultaneously. "I'm going to need more than sorry," she said. "I know. I'm going to need explanations, real ones, all of them, including the parts that don't reflect well on you." "Yes, and I'm going to need to talk to my father before Nathan does." Vincent reached into his jacket. "A phone. His number is already dialed, whenever you're ready." She looked at the phone. She thought about her father, who didn't know any of this, who had spent 30 years building something that had been used as a weapon behind his back. She thought about how he would take it, the controlled fury of a man who built things and did not easily forgive people who tried to pull them down. She took the phone. But before she dialed, she looked at Vincent one more time. "The restaurant," she said. He blinked. "What?" "We talked about opening a restaurant. When we were 22, a small place. You wanted it in the Marigny." She watched his face. "Do you remember?" Something moved through his expression, deep and unguarded. The first thing she'd seen from him all morning that hadn't been managed. "Yes," he said. "I remember." "I thought about it for years," she said. "After you left. I didn't know why I kept thinking about it. Just a restaurant. But I think—" She paused. "I think I kept thinking about it because it was the future we'd built together. The one that was supposed to be real." She looked at him. "That's what you took from me. Not just you, the future we planned." He didn't answer. He didn't look away. "I'm not telling you that so you'll feel worse," she said. "I'm telling you that so you understand what I mean when I say you owe me more than sorry. You owe me the truth, all of it, for as long as it takes." "Then that's what you'll get," he said. She looked at the phone. She dialed her father, and outside, somewhere behind them, Nathan Holloway was standing in a ballroom full of people who were going to need a story, and he was building one, and it was going to be very well constructed, and it was going to be entirely a lie, and the next several months of Emily Carter's life were going to require everything she had to dismantle it. But she had already made the hard choice today. The rest was just the work. Her father picked up on the second ring. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something. All of it. Can you sit down?" A pause. "Emily, what is happening? Where are you?" "I'm safe," she said. And for the first time today, she knew that was exactly true. "I'm somewhere safe. But I need to tell you everything, and I need you to listen before you say anything. Can you do that for me?" Another pause, and she could hear him, the steady breath of a man calibrating himself the way he'd always done before the hard conversations. "All right," he said. "I'm listening." She looked out at the city. She started at the beginning, and the black helicopter that had circled the Beaumont estate all morning finally peeled away, its job done, leaving behind a ceremony that would never be completed, and a war that was just beginning. And Nathan Holloway's final text arrived on Emily's phone at that exact moment. A text she didn't open yet, because some things could wait, and this conversation could not. The helicopter didn't land. Not yet. It held its position over the estate, low enough to rattle the chandelier crystals above the ballroom, low enough that the rotor wash bent the tops of the live oaks along the property line, and the effect on 240 guests was immediate and complete. The processional music stopped. The flower girl sat down in the middle of the aisle and started crying. 3 people near the back stood up. Nathan's head of security, a thick-necked man named Briggs, who had been stationed near the entrance with the practiced invisibility of someone paid to be unnoticed, was suddenly very visible. Pressing 2 fingers to his earpiece and scanning the room with an expression that had gone from professional neutrality to something considerably less neutral. Nathan at the altar had not moved. That was what Emily noticed most, that he hadn't moved, hadn't looked alarmed, had simply shifted from one kind of stillness to another. The composed warmth he'd been performing for the guests had gone somewhere underneath his expression, replaced by something colder and more honest. He was calculating. She could almost see it happening the way a machine reroutes when one path is blocked. Her father's hand tightened on her arm. "Emily, what is that?" "I don't know," she said. It was not technically a lie. She didn't know exactly what Vincent was doing. She'd asked for a few hours. He appeared to have interpreted that instruction liberally. The coordinator was in her earpiece. "We're going to pause the processional. Mrs. Holloway, Ms. Carter, we're pausing. Please stay in position." Emily stayed in position. The helicopter banked left, moved away from directly overhead, and the rattling in the chandelier subsided. The guests who had stood up sat back down with the uncertain, embarrassed energy of people who had reacted too quickly. Someone laughed a short, relieved laugh, and the murmur of 240 people processing a shared confusion filled the room. Nathan's eyes found Emily's across the length of the aisle. She read the message in them without difficulty. "We will discuss this later." She looked back at him with an expression she had practiced for 2 years without knowing she was practicing it. Calm, pleasant. The face of a woman who had nothing to hide. Her father leaned close to her ear. "His security team just went outside." "I see that." "Emily." His voice was lower now, carrying something she hadn't heard in it before, a specific weight, the kind that meant he was paying very careful attention. "Is there something I need to know?" She looked at her father's face. Robert Carter had spent 40 years reading job sites, reading structural problems that hadn't yet become failures, reading the signs that something was wrong before anyone else saw them. He was not a man who missed things. He had simply, she understood now, been allowing her to believe he missed them. Because she was his daughter, and he loved her, and he had trusted her to tell him when she needed him. Yes, she said quietly, "but not right now." He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. One slow nod, the kind that meant, "I hear you, and I'm not going anywhere." "I'm right here," he said. "I know, Dad." The coordinator's voice returned. "We're resuming in 60 seconds. Everything is fine. Just we're resuming." Emily faced forward. 60 seconds. She had been 22 years old the first time she understood that Vincent Moretti was something different from what she'd initially cataloged him as. Her father's company had been mid-sized, then growing fast, always slightly stretched, the kind of operation that runs on the owner's ability to be in 4 places simultaneously. Robert Carter had been renovating a commercial property in the warehouse district, and Vincent had been on the crew for 3 months. One of the younger guys, Quiet, reliable, the kind of worker her father said you noticed. Not because he made noise, but because when you looked at a finished section and thought that's right, it was usually his work. Emily had been finishing her last year of business school and spending her weekends helping her father with administrative overflow permits, contractor invoices, supplier communications. She'd been at the site one Saturday morning to drop off signed documents, and she'd found Vincent eating lunch alone on a stack of lumber with a library book open on his knee. She'd said something she couldn't remember exactly. What's something arch about construction workers who read during their lunch break? And he'd looked up at her with an expression that was entirely unimpressed and said, "Do construction workers have a reading list I'm not aware of?" She'd laughed. She hadn't expected to. He hadn't smiled, just watched her laugh with that quality of complete stillness she'd eventually come to understand as simply how he existed in the world. She'd sat down on the lumber beside him and asked what he was reading. He'd shown her. Structural engineering theory. Self-taught, he'd said. He'd been trying to understand load-bearing mathematics because he wanted to understand why some structures lasted and some failed, and the foreman's explanations weren't satisfying. "You want to be an engineer?" she'd asked. "I want to understand things," he'd said. "That's different." She had thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. They'd started talking in the ways that people do when they're young, and something has clicked into place without either of them deciding it. Conversations that ran long and then longer, that moved from architecture to food to family histories, to the kind of late-night honesty that only happens when two people have lost track of the hour. He was an orphan, raised between two foster families and a group home with no inherited framework for how life was supposed to work, and consequently, a very clear-eyed view of how it actually did. She had grown up with everything provided and had spent her entire education trying to figure out what she actually wanted, which turned out to be harder when nothing was denied you. They were on paper entirely mismatched. In the actual world, they fit in a way that Emily had not found before or after. They'd been together for 8 months when the dream came up: the restaurant. It had started as a joke. She'd said she wanted to open something small, something personal, not the corporate trajectory her business degree was pointed toward. He'd said he could do the build-out himself, save them the contractor costs. They'd started joking about menus, and then the jokes had become serious, and then they'd been spending Sundays in her apartment with spreadsheets and floor plan sketches, and she had been happier in those Sundays than she'd been in any of her carefully organized years before them. Then one morning, he was gone. Not gradually, not with a conversation or a note or even a text. She'd called him, and the number had rung through to voicemail and kept ringing to voicemail, and then one day it hadn't rung at all. She'd gone to the address she had for him, a rented room above a laundromat in mid-city, and the landlord had told her he'd moved out without notice, paid through the end of the month in cash, left nothing behind. She had filed a missing persons report. The police had told her that an adult man who chose to leave was not a missing person. She had asked everyone she knew who had known him. She had driven routes they used to drive. She had sat in the restaurants they used to go to and waited without being able to explain to herself what she was waiting for. For 6 months, she had genuinely believed he was dead. For the 6 months after that, she had believed something that was harder: that he had chosen to leave. That she had misjudged everything. That the person she thought she knew had not existed in the way she'd believed he existed. She had rebuilt herself around that belief. And she had never once stopped loving him, which was the thing she had worked hardest to keep herself from knowing. The processional resumed. Emily walked. Her father's arm was solid under her hand, and she moved forward with the music and the weight of the dress and the focused attention of 240 people. And she thought about the last thing Vincent had said in that upstairs room. "I never stopped." He'd cut himself off. Started again with the apology. But she'd heard the shape of the sentence he hadn't finished, and she carried it now the way you carry something fragile carefully, without looking at it too directly. Nathan watched her approach with an expression that had reorganized itself back into warmth. But the temperature of that warmth had changed. He was angry. She knew exactly what his anger looked like because she had spent 2 years learning to read the signs of it before it surfaced: the slight compression at the corners of his mouth, the way his chin tilted up a fraction of an inch, the quality of his stillness that was different from Vincent's stillness in every possible way. Nathan's stillness was control. It was a lid on something. She stopped beside him at the altar. He took her hand. His grip was as always cool and precisely firm. "Beautiful," he murmured. "Thank you." He leaned slightly toward her, not enough for the guests to read as anything but an intimate moment. "We have some things to discuss after the ceremony." "I'm sure we do," she said. The officiant, a judge named Carver, whom Nathan had known for 15 years, began speaking. Emily looked straight ahead and listened and understood nothing he said, because her entire cognitive function had divided itself. One part maintaining the surface performance, one part working through what she actually knew. What she knew was this: Nathan Holloway had been building toward this marriage for the better part of 3 years. She had found 2 references months ago to a woman named Claudia Rice, a name that had appeared in his phone, deleted but recoverable, if you knew where to look, which Emily hadn't known until 3 weeks ago. She had found those references in the same search that had turned up the financial documents. Claudia Rice was an attorney in Atlanta, professional connection on the surface. The kind of professional connection whose text message history covered topics that were not professional at all. Nathan had a relationship he had never mentioned. He also, according to a photograph Emily had found, that she had not been meant to find a photograph buried in a cloud. Backup linked to an account she'd stumbled across while trying to recover a deleted work document. He also had a child. A boy, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, photographed with his mother in what appeared to be a park in Atlanta. The photograph had been taken with Nathan's phone. She knew it had been taken with his phone because the metadata was still attached. She hadn't confronted him about those 2 things specifically. She'd shown him the financial documents and watched him explain. And in that explanation, she'd heard all the things he hadn't said. She'd understood that the confrontation she'd been building toward was not the kind that ended in honesty. It was the kind that ended in consequences. So she'd waited. And she'd been waiting. And now she was standing at an altar in $12,000 of silk with a man who had calculated every detail of this day. And she was thinking about a helicopter and a man in a dark suit and 7 years of silence that she was beginning to understand might not mean what she'd always believed it meant. The officiant said, "If anyone present knows of any reason," and outside the helicopter came back. This time it was lower. The sound hit the estate like a physical thing, a wave of displaced air and mechanical percussion that rattled the windows and stopped the judge mid-sentence and sent the same ripple through the assembled guests that a second tremor sends through people who've just survived the first one. The initial shock had primed them. This time the reaction was faster and louder. Nathan's grip on Emily's hand went tight. "Briggs," he said, not loudly, not with any outward display of alarm, just a single word directed at a specific person who had been stationed. She now saw much closer to the altar than wedding security typically stood. Briggs was already moving toward the main doors. The officiant looked at Nathan with a question on his face. "Proceed," Nathan said. There was a fundamental presumptuousness in that proceeding with a wedding ceremony, while something was happening outside that had turned half the guest list in their chairs, and Emily saw several guests register it. A federal judge sitting in the 3rd row on the groom's side looked at Nathan with an expression that was not the expression of a wedding guest. It was the expression of a man recalibrating something. Nathan noticed. And the noticing showed just for a moment. He turned back to the officiant. Then the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Briggs had not opened them. Someone from outside had. The man who walked through the doors of the Beaumont Estates ballroom was exactly as Emily had last seen him. Dark suit, no tie. The particular quality of presence that she had spent 7 years trying to describe to herself and had never found a word for. He walked the way men walk when they have decided that the space they are moving through is already theirs, not because they've claimed it, but because they've stopped caring whether it is or not. He didn't hurry. He didn't look at the guests on either side. He didn't look at Nathan. He looked only at Emily. 240 people turned to watch him walk down the aisle. Nathan said, "Remove him." No one moved. Briggs had 3 men with him. Emily could see them behind Vincent, having apparently attempted and then reconsidered some form of interception, and all 3 were standing very still. She didn't know why. She would understand later when she knew more about the kind of organization Vincent had built and what it meant when certain people stood aside. Right now, she only knew that they were standing still, and Vincent was still walking. He stopped 12 feet from the altar. He looked at her, only at her. "I'm not here to take you away," he said. His voice was level, unhurried, carrying in the silence, the way a voice carries in a room full of people who have forgotten to breathe. "I'm here to ask if this is really your choice." The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Nathan said with the smooth certainty of a man who has managed rooms for 20 years, "Mr. Moretti, this is a private event. Remove yourself or I'll have you arrested." Vincent didn't look at him. "Emily," he said, just her name, again. The way he'd said it in the upstairs room, like it was a complete sentence. And this was the moment, the fulcrum moment, the one that everything before had been building toward, and everything after would be defined by when Emily Carter understood something about herself that she had been circling for 2 years without landing on. She was not afraid. She had been afraid for so long. Afraid of Nathan's quiet anger. Afraid of what would happen to her father's company. Afraid of the loss of the life she'd constructed. Afraid of the version of herself that had needed to be reconstructed after Vincent left, that she had mistaken the fear for wisdom. She'd told herself that accepting the terms of Nathan's world was realism. She'd told herself that the comfortable trap was still preferable to the unknown outside it. But she was standing at an altar in front of 240 people, and a man she did not love who had texted her a threat that morning, and across the length of a wedding aisle. A man she had spent 7 years grieving was looking at her with an expression that asked nothing except one thing, and the fear was simply gone. What was under it was something she recognized from a long time ago. Herself. She looked at Nathan. I was watching her with the precision of someone who has run 1,000 calculations and is very certain of the outcome. He was certain. That was what she saw. He was completely certain that she would do what she was supposed to do. She said no. Nathan's expression didn't move. "Emily," he started. "No." Louder now. Not a shout, just a voice that had decided to take up its full space. "I don't want to marry you." The room erupted. It erupted not in this way of something falling apart, but in the way of something finally naming what it was. Several guests stood up not in protest, but in the instinctive physical response to something significant happening. The flower girl who had been sitting in the aisle for most of the ceremony started crying again. Dara made a sound that Emily heard clearly from across the room, something between a sob and a laugh, an exhale of something long held. Margaret Carter said her daughter's name once quietly, and then said nothing else. Nathan moved. He stepped forward toward Emily, and his hand came out for her arm, a gesture that probably looked from the guest perspective like a groom reaching for a distressed bride. Emily knew it wasn't. Vincent's hand was on Nathan's wrist before he completed the motion. Not with force, not dramatically. He simply took Nathan's wrist and held it the way you hold a door to stop it closing. Nathan looked down at the hand, then up at Vincent, and in Nathan Holloway's face for the first time in 2 years of knowing him, Emily saw something genuine. It was not anger exactly. It was something older than anger and colder, and she was glad she was not the target of it. "You have no idea," Nathan said very quietly, "what you've just done." Vincent looked at him for a moment. "I have a reasonable idea," he said, and released his wrist. Nathan turned to the assembled guests. Politicians, judges, business partners, people whose regard he had spent 20 years building, and he performed. Even now. Even here. He turned on a contained, dignified expression that said, "This is a private matter, and I apologize for the disruption, and we will handle this without saying any of those things explicitly." And it was so smooth and so practiced that Emily felt watching it a kind of cold admiration for the sheer technical proficiency of it. Then he said loud enough for the room, "Ms. Carter is clearly under some kind of duress. We should give her space." Emily laughed. She hadn't planned to laugh. It came out of something genuine, not humor exactly, but the absurdity of being described as under duress by the person who had texted her a threat 5 hours ago. It was a short laugh, surprised and clear. "I'm not under duress," she said to the room, to all of them, to the judges and the politicians and the business partners who were Nathan's structural support system, his framework of legitimacy. I'm making a choice, probably the first clear one I've made in 2 years. She looked at Nathan one more time. You'll want to call your lawyer, she said. The one you actually trust, not the ones at your firm. She picked up her train and stepped off the platform. She walked to Vincent, who was still standing exactly where he'd stopped, not having moved during any of it. She did not take his hand. She stood beside him and said quietly enough that only he heard, I have about 47 questions. I know, he said, and I'm furious. I know that too. Good. She looked ahead toward the back of the room. Let's go. They walked out together, not dramatically, not running, just walking through 240 people who parted without being asked to, through the doors of the Beaumont estate, out into the Louisiana morning that smelled like gardenias and heat and the faint mechanical scent of helicopter exhaust. Behind her, she heard Nathan's voice stripped of its professional finish, for the first time, sharp cold, aimed at someone specific. Find out everything, he said, and shut it down, all of it. Emily walked faster. The car was waiting outside the estate's iron gates, a black SUV engine running a driver she didn't recognize who opened the rear door without speaking. Vincent moved ahead of her to the gate, and she followed, and she did not look back, because looking back was for people who were uncertain, and she had just been more certain than she'd been in years. She got in the car. The door closed. Vincent got in the other side. The SUV moved immediately, pulling smoothly into the street while the sounds of the Beaumont estate fell behind them. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. Then Emily said, Tell me about Claudia Rice. Vincent looked at her. He hadn't expected that. She could tell by the very slight change in his expression, the only tell he'd ever had. What do you know about her? He asked. I know she exists. I know Nathan has a child with her. I know that child is approximately 4 years old, which means Nathan was already involved with her before he and I were engaged. She kept her voice flat and even, the way her father kept his voice on job sites when something had gone structurally wrong and emotional reaction would not fix it. I know because I found a photograph. I know because I found documents. I've known for 3 weeks, and I've been very quiet about it because I needed to understand the full structure before I did anything about it. Vincent was watching her with that completely still expression. You already knew, he said. Most of it, yes. Then the text this morning was the last piece, she said. I needed to know if he'd actually say it in writing, if he was that certain he had me. She paused. He was. A silence. You're not in distress, Vincent said. It wasn't a question. No. You planned this. I planned part of it. She looked at him. The part I didn't plan was you. I sent that text before I thought it through, but I don't regret it. Why did you send it? It was the question he'd asked upstairs, and she'd given him the answer both, and it had been true. But she could be more specific now. Because I knew if there was anyone who could move faster than Nathan, she said, it was you. And because she stopped, started differently. Because some part of me needed to know if you were actually there. If the contact I'd never deleted went anywhere real. Vincent held her gaze for a moment. It does, he said. I see that. Another silence. The city moved past the windows. New Orleans at mid-morning, beautiful and oblivious, going about its ordinary business, while Emily Carter dismantled her life in the back of a moving vehicle. Now, she said, start at the beginning. 7 years ago, the morning you weren't there. Vincent let out a slow breath. A man came to me, he said. 2 days before I disappeared. His name was Caruso. He ran an organization not Nathan's level, older, more embedded. They had interests in your father's construction contracts. They'd been skimming from supplier invoices for years, and your father hadn't noticed, and they intended to keep not being noticed. I'd found it. I hadn't been looking for it. I found it in a document I wasn't supposed to see, same as what happened to you with Nathan. He paused. He told me if I stayed near you, near your family, they would make sure your father's company failed. Not just failed. They would make sure your father went to prison for fraud he didn't commit using evidence they would fabricate. He had the structure in place to do it. I believed him. Emily was very still. "And you didn't come to me," she said. "I was 22 years old, and I had nothing," Vincent said. "No money, no connections, remove myself. To give them no reason to keep the pressure on." "So you just left?" "I left. And then I found people who knew how to fight the kind of organization Caruso ran. It took 2 years, cost things I don't want to describe. By the time I'd dismantled enough of it to come back." He stopped. "What?" "You were with someone," he said. "A lawyer, serious. You looked—" He paused again, and she heard something in the pause that he clearly hadn't intended to let through. "You looked like you'd rebuilt, like you had a life that was working. And I thought, you thought you'd already cost me enough," she said. He said nothing. "So you watched instead," she said. "From wherever you'd gotten yourself to. You watched and you kept your distance, and you told yourself it was for my sake." "Yes." "Was it?" A long silence. The SUV slowed for a traffic signal. "Partly," he said. "What's the other part?" He looked out the window. "Cowardice," he said quietly. "The other part was that I didn't know how to be what you deserved anymore. I'd spent 2 years in that world, and I'd made choices I couldn't take back, and I didn't know how to stand in front of you and be honest about all of it." Emily absorbed that. "So you watched," she said. "I watched. I made sure certain opportunities came to people around you. Your father's company landing the Riverside contract that wasn't coincidence. Dara's lease dispute resolving in her favor. I had a conversation with the right person. Your mother's charity getting renewed nonprofit status after the IRS review. I knew people at the filing level." Emily turned to look at him. "How long?" she said. 4 years, he said. "Give or take. 4 years of making decisions about my life without asking me." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was controlled but not cold, something in it that had a shape, a weight. "Vincent," she said, "I need you to understand something. What Nathan did using my family as leverage, controlling the terms of my life, deciding what was best for me without telling me what he was actually doing, that is exactly what you just described. You both decided what I needed. You both arranged my circumstances without asking me. The intentions are different, completely different, but the method is the same." He didn't defend himself. She'd half expected him to. He didn't. "I know," he said. "I'm not finished being angry about it. I know that too." "Good." She turned back to the window. Her breath was even. "Now tell me about Nathan's federal investigation. Everything you know. Because if I'm going to fight this, I need the full picture." And Vincent started talking. He talked while the city moved past the windows about the 14-month investigation, about the structure of the financial crimes, about the political relationships Nathan had been buying for a decade, and the price that was now coming due. He talked about the specific exposure Nathan faced, and why the marriage had been a calculated move to build character evidence before the indictment arrived. He talked about what he had, and what he could provide, and what he believed Emily could do with it if she chose to. She listened. She asked 3 questions. She interrupted once to correct a detail she knew from her own research that he'd gotten slightly wrong, and the surprise on his face was, she admitted privately, somewhat satisfying. By the time the SUV reached the building where Vincent's organization kept its operational headquarters, a renovated warehouse in the Bywater that looked entirely ordinary from outside, Emily had the complete architecture of the situation in her head. She had the shape of what had been done to her. She had the shape of what had been done around her without her knowledge or consent. And she realized sitting in that car before the door opened, a very clear picture of exactly what she intended to do about both of those things. She got out of the car. She looked at the building. She looked at Vincent, who was watching her with the careful expression of a man who has said more than he intended and is uncertain what comes next. "I need a lawyer," she said. "My own. Not yours, not anyone connected to you. Someone completely independent. I can make a recommendation." "I'll find my own," she said. He closed his mouth. "I also need a phone," she said. "One that Nathan can't access. And I need to call my father." "All of that is available." Good. She started toward the building. And Vincent? Yeah. You don't make any more decisions on my behalf. She said it without turning around. Not one. Not small ones, not large ones. You tell me what you know and you let me decide. That's the condition. He was quiet for a moment. That's fair, he said. She pushed through the door. Behind her, she could hear the distant sounds of the city traffic birds. The ordinary Tuesday afternoon of a place that didn't know what had just happened in a ballroom on the other side of it. Somewhere across that city in the Beaumont estate, 240 guests were talking. Nathan was making phone calls with the composed efficiency of someone executing a plan he'd already prepared. His political allies were beginning to move, checking the positions they held, assessing the damage and the counter-strategy. And Emily Carter was walking into a warehouse in the Bywater, in a $12,000 wedding dress she had not yet taken off, about to make the most important calls of her life. Her phone buzzed. Nathan. Not a call, a text. You've made a very significant mistake. I want you to understand before this goes further exactly what the next 30 days look like for your father's company. She looked at it. She typed back 2 words. Call your lawyer. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went to find the independent line. Outside, she heard it again. The sound she would later come to think of as the sound of the moment her life changed. Not the helicopter this time. Just the city. Just the ordinary ongoing noise of a world that was going to keep moving whether she rebuilt herself inside it or not. She intended to rebuild. She intended to rebuild it her way on her terms with her hands. And this time, she intended to understand every single thing that was happening around her. She pulled open the interior door and walked forward into whatever came next. The helicopter didn't land. Not yet. It circled once, a slow, deliberate arc over the Beaumont estate, and then pulled back, hovering at a distance that was close enough to be impossible to ignore, and far enough to be technically lawful. The sound filled the ballroom like a second heartbeat, low and insistent, and 240 guests had stopped pretending to watch the processional. Emily kept walking. She kept her eyes forward, her hand resting on her father's arm, her pace steady. The string quartet had recovered from the stumble and was playing on a small act of professional courage that she found absurdly moving. Her bouquet was steady in her hands. Her expression was the expression she had practiced in the mirror for 3 weeks, composed, present, appropriate. Nathan was watching her from the altar. His smile was back, fully reconstructed, but his eyes had not returned to their usual temperature. His eyes were doing something they almost never did. They were working, calculating, scanning the ceiling, the windows, the back of the room, and then returning to her with a focus that was not warmth. It was assessment. She thought, he doesn't know it's Vincent. She thought he's about to find out. She reached the altar. Her father placed her hand and stepped back, and the officiant opened his remarks, and the quartet faded, and the room settled into the particular quiet of 240 people holding their breath together. The helicopter sound had diminished, not gone, but pulled back enough to be ambiguous. Maybe it was passing through. Maybe it was nothing. Nathan took her hands. His grip was practiced. Firm enough to communicate ownership, light enough to photograph well. You look incredible, he murmured for the room's benefit. She smiled. She thought about the text on her phone still locked in her clutch with her lipstick and her phone and the card from her mother that said, "I'm so proud of you." She thought about Vincent standing in Suite 4 saying, "Buy us time." She thought about her father's grip on her arm 30 seconds ago, solid, certain, the grip of a man who trusted the ground under his feet. She thought, how much time is enough time? The officiant was speaking. She heard individual words without assembling them into meaning. She nodded when nodding seemed appropriate. She maintained the smile. She was performing the first 20 minutes of a wedding with enough accuracy that no one in the room could see what was happening behind her eyes, which was a complete and total reckoning with every choice she had made in the past 2 years. That was when Dara caught her eye. Dara was standing in the bridesmaid line 3 feet to Emily's left, and she was looking at her phone. The phone was angled low out of general eye line, the way Dara had held her phone during boring lectures in college, visible to Emily, invisible to the room. She tilted the screen slightly. A text notification. Dara's contact name for the sender read, "Unknown, don't delete." The preview showed 3 words: watch the doors. Emily had met Nathan Holloway at a charity fundraiser 26 months ago, and in the beginning, he had been genuinely impressive. She understood that now, not as a thing to feel ashamed of, but as a fact. He had been impressive. He was intelligent in the way that showed immediately the kind of intelligence that organized information quickly and communicated it cleanly. He was funny in small doses, dry, precise humor that landed well in professional settings. He was attentive in the early months, asking specific questions and remembering the answers, which she had found remarkable, because she wasn't used to being listened to by men who could also command a room. Her father had liked him. That had mattered enormously. Her mother had been quietly thrilled. He's established Emily. He's not going anywhere, and her mother's particular fear, the one she had never fully articulated, but had communicated through 29 years of careful suggestions, was that Emily would choose someone unstable, someone who might leave, someone like Vincent. No one had ever said that directly. It had simply been the unspoken subtext of every conversation about Emily's romantic choices since she was 22 years old, when she had fallen completely and irretrievably in love with a man who worked construction for her father and disappeared overnight. She had never told anyone the full truth about Vincent. She had never explained the specific weight of it, the way she had loved him, which was the kind of loving she'd only been able to recognize in retrospect because it had felt at the time simply like breathing. Normal. Necessary. She had loved him the way she breathed without examining it, and when he left, she had understood for the first time what it meant to be aware of every single breath. She had rebuilt herself over 3 years, very carefully, very deliberately. She had built a version of herself that was contained and organized and did not make choices based on how a person made her feel in her chest. She had built a version of herself that evaluated people on observable evidence, reasonable criteria, long-term compatibility. The vocabulary of someone who has been badly hurt and has decided that the solution is to stop trusting invisible things. And it had worked mostly. It had worked well enough to get her here. Standing at an altar, holding the hands of a man she had evaluated and selected and organized her life around, in a dress that had cost $12,000, in a room full of people who believed this was a celebration. She thought about the word established. She thought about her mother saying it and meaning safe, and meaning something that, if she was honest, had meant not Vincent. She thought, what a long way to travel in the wrong direction. The officiant was asking the guests to be seated. Emily kept her eyes on Nathan's face. His face gave nothing away. That had once seemed like a quality steadiness, self-possession. Now she recognized it for what it was. Not composure. Containment. The face of a man who had practiced for decades not showing what he was actually doing. She had spent 2 years looking at that face and reading it as safety. She had spent 2 years building the cage herself. 7 years earlier, Vincent Moretti had been working a summer contract for Carter Construction, a commercial renovation in the Garden District. 3 months of work that paid well and offered him something more valuable than the rate, which was the chance to learn from a foreman who actually knew what he was doing. He was 22. He had aged out of the foster system at 18, worked every job that would have him since then, and saved enough money to take a few courses at the community college while working full-time. He was not supposed to be the kind of person Emily Carter fell for. He was clear on that. It was the first thing he'd thought when he understood what was happening between them. This is not for people like me, and it was also the first thing he'd decided to stop listening to. Emily had found him in the site office at the end of a Tuesday afternoon, reading a structural engineering textbook on his lunch break. She'd been dropping off documents for her father, who was running the project. She'd looked at the textbook, then at him, then at the textbook again. "You're studying," she'd said. "I'm reading," he'd corrected. "Studying implies I have somewhere to apply it." "Don't you?" He'd looked at her. She'd looked back at him without any of the social calculation he'd spent years learning to navigate, no assessment of what he could do for her, no positioning. Just genuine curiosity, the kind that doesn't know it should be rationing itself. "I'm thinking about it," he'd said. "What would you do with it if you applied it somewhere?" He'd told her. Tentatively at first, then with increasing directness, because she kept asking specific follow-up questions, and he kept answering them before he could decide whether to. He'd told her about the restaurant idea, a small place, nothing elaborate but built right. Built to last, designed with the same precision he'd started applying to everything he touched. Good food, good bones, a place that felt permanent. She'd laughed, not unkindly, the laugh of someone recognizing something. "That's not what construction workers usually want," she'd said. "I'm not usually a construction worker," he'd said. "This is just what I'm doing right now." She'd looked at him for a long moment. Then she'd said, "I'm Emily," as though they hadn't already been introduced, as though the introduction needed to be done differently. "I know," he'd said. "Vincent." "I know." They had talked for 45 minutes. Her father had come looking for her twice. 3 months became 6. 6 became 9. The renovation project was extended, and then a second project was offered. And by then the question of why Vincent kept accepting Carter construction work had an answer so obvious that no one said it out loud. Emily's parents knew. They were not thrilled, not in an ugly way, not in a way anyone made explicit, but the particular quality of her mother's politeness when Vincent was at dinner and her father's careful questions about his plans made the position legible. They liked him well enough in the abstract. He was capable and respectful and clearly intelligent. But he was not what they had imagined for Emily, and the imagination of parents for their children is a force that operates quietly and shapes everything. Vincent understood this. It didn't stop him. Nothing stopped him in those months. He was 22 and 23 and completely undefended against what he felt for her, and he had spent his whole life in situations where the correct response to difficulty was to get through it. And this was not difficulty. This was the first thing in his life that felt like it had been built specifically for him to inhabit. Like it fit. They talked about the restaurant constantly. Where it would be, they argued cheerfully about neighborhoods, about whether Uptown was better than the Marigny, about what the menu should center on. They argued about names. She wanted something simple. He wanted something that meant something. They never agreed on the name, which was fine, because they had years to figure it out. Except they didn't. Because on a Thursday night in November, when Emily was at her best friend's apartment, and Vincent was finishing a late site inspection, 3 men were waiting for him in the parking structure where he'd left his truck. He knew one of them by reputation. The man's name was Carver Royce. He operated on the edges of legitimate business throughout the Gulf Coast and had interests in several construction and logistics operations, including Vincent had recently figured out a quiet stake in 2 of Carter Construction's largest subcontractors. He was not famous. He was not the kind of man who needed to be famous. He sat precisely where obscurity was most valuable, and exercised the kind of power that only worked when nobody could see it clearly. He didn't raise his voice. He offered Vincent a seat in a parked car and explained in the tone of someone describing weather patterns that Vincent's continued presence in Emily Carter's life had created a complication. The Carter family had become relevant to certain business arrangements. Emily herself was not particularly relevant, but the attention she'd drawn to a specific corner of her father's contracting relationships was beginning to create friction. Nothing irreparable, Royce had said, but friction. Then he had explained what would happen if the friction was not resolved. He hadn't threatened Vincent. He'd been considerably more precise than that. He'd specified exactly which members of Emily's family would be affected, and in exactly which ways, and the specificity was the point. The demonstration that he could see into every corner of their lives, that the threat was not hypothetical, but operational. That the only variable was whether Vincent would make the decision that would prevent it. Vincent had sat in that car for a long time. Then he'd asked one question. If I go completely no contact, you leave them alone. Entirely, Royce had said. You have my word. Vincent had understood that the word of a man like Royce was not a reliable instrument. He had also understood that he had no countermove. He was 23 years old. He had savings and a community college transcript and a construction skill set, and the absolute conviction that what Royce was describing, what would happen to Robert Carter's contracts, to Emily's mother's foundations, to Emily herself. If she was used as leverage in a business dispute she had no knowledge of, was not something he could prevent with any resource he currently possessed. He'd said yes. He'd gone back to his apartment that night, and he had sat on his bed for 4 hours, and he'd thought about the restaurant, about the name they'd never settled on, about the look on her face on Tuesday afternoons when she'd appear at whatever job site he was working, allegedly dropping something off for her father, and the expression she'd forget to control in the 30 seconds before she noticed he'd seen it. He had written her a letter and then thrown it away. He had picked up his phone to call her 17 times. He had not called. He had packed. He had driven north. He had told himself it was temporary, just until he had the resources to do something about Carver Royce, which was not a plan so much as a direction, because it was all he had. He hadn't known it would take 7 years. He hadn't known in those 7 years that watching from a distance would become its own kind of prison. Emily didn't know any of this yet. She knew the facts as she had understood them at 22, that Vincent had left without a word, that she had waited 3 weeks before accepting the reality that she had spent 6 months believing he was dead, because it was the only story that made the leaving make sense, and that when he hadn't turned up dead, she had been forced to rebuild her understanding of what had happened into something considerably more painful. She had told herself he'd chosen something else. Freedom. Ambition. Some other life that didn't include her. She had told herself this story until she believed it. She had selected Nathan Holloway partly because Nathan Holloway had never once in 26 months shown the slightest inclination to leave. She understood now, standing at this altar, that this was not a quality. It was a strategy. The officiant's voice was still moving through the ceremony. They had passed the readings. They were approaching the vows. Nathan squeezed her hands. "Almost there," he murmured. "Just for her. Just under the level of the microphone." She looked at his face. She thought about almost there. She thought about what was on the other side of almost there, and what her life looked like inside it. Another year, 2 years, 5 years of this face, telling her what the correct expression was for every room. Her name on every photograph. Her credibility as mortar between the stones of something she hadn't built and didn't want to hold together. She thought about her father's contracts. She thought Vincent said the investigation is already running. The indictment is coming regardless. The only question is whose name is next to Nathan's when it arrives. She thought, if I walk out of here today, Nathan destroys what he can. If I stay, the federal government eventually destroys all of it anyway, and I'm standing in the rubble holding his hand. The math was not complicated. It was just terrifying. Then her phone buzzed. Inside the small clutch on her wrist, she'd refused to hand it off, and the coordinator had been too professional to fight about it. Her phone buzzed twice. Short. Deliberate. The pattern Vincent had used 7 years ago to indicate a text when she was somewhere she couldn't check her screen. Her heart did something that was not appropriate for a wedding ceremony. She kept her expression exactly where it was. Nathan was looking at her. "You all right?" he murmured. "Fine," she said. "Sorry. Nervous." He smiled. The smile that communicated warmth for the room. She felt his fingers tighten slightly on hers. She thought 2 buzzes. Dara caught her eye again, still holding the phone at that discreet angle. This time she tilted it more deliberately enough that Emily could see the screen. The notification was from the same unknown. "Don't delete contact." The preview read, 3 minutes. "Trust me." Dara raised her eyes from the phone to Emily's face. Her expression was not a bridesmaid's expression anymore. It was the expression of a woman who has known someone for 20 years and is reading the situation in real time. She gave the smallest possible nod. She tucked the phone away. She shifted her position in the bridesmaid's line by approximately 6 inches, placing herself with a clearer sightline to the main entrance at the back of the ballroom. Emily loved her so much in that moment that she nearly said it out loud. The officiant had reached the section of the ceremony that Emily's vague liturgical knowledge identified as the pause before vows, the moment of rhetorical gathering, the verbal intake of breath before the central question. Nathan was looking at her with the expression that had served him for 2 years, devoted, certain, performed. She thought about 3 minutes. She thought about what "trust me" meant from a man who had disappeared without explanation and reappeared with a federal investigation and a helicopter. She thought about her father sitting in the 3rd row, present and calm, and entirely without information. She thought about Dara's 6-inch shift. She thought 3 minutes is a long time to stand still. The officiant began the vow section. Nathan released one of her hands and turned slightly to accept the ring from his best man, a partner at the firm named Garrett, who had always looked at Emily with an expression she had consistently chosen not to examine. The small logistical movement of the ring handoff. The return of Nathan's full attention. He said, beginning the vow, "I, Nathan Holloway." That was when the main doors of the Beaumont Estates Grand Ballroom opened, not with a crash, not with drama. They opened the way well-maintained doors open when someone with a purpose pushes through them smoothly, decisively, with the sound of air pressure shifting and the low creak of heavy hinges that hadn't been built for this kind of entrance. The guests turned. 239 heads in near-perfect unison rotated toward the back of the room. Nathan went absolutely still. Emily felt his hand on hers go from the practiced grip to something much harder, much less composed. And then Vincent Moretti walked into the wedding. He was alone. No entourage, no visible security, nothing theatrical, except the fact of him tall and unhurried in the dark suit, moving through the center aisle of the ballroom, the way he had always moved through any space, which was as though the space had been expecting him and was simply confirming his arrival. He didn't look at Nathan. He looked at Emily. The room had gone to a silence so complete that she could hear the distant rotor sound of the helicopter still present, still circling a steady percussion beneath the stillness inside. Emily's father turned in his seat. Her mother's hand went to her mouth. Dara, alone among all the people in the room, did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Emily's face with the steady, grounded presence of someone who had been told to stay and was staying. Nathan said very quietly, in a voice that was not for the room, "Emily." It was the voice he used when she'd made an error that required correction. She didn't look at him. Vincent was halfway down the aisle now. "Security," Nathan said louder. To Garrett, to the two suited men stationed near the side walls, who were technically there to manage the event's logistics, but were understood by anyone paying attention to be there for other purposes. Neither of them moved. Vincent reached the altar. He stopped. He looked at Emily, not at Nathan, not at the officiant, not at the room with the expression she had seen in Suite 4 upstairs, and then again in every memory she'd spent 7 years trying to flatten. The expression of a man who has made a very long journey to arrive at a specific moment and is aware completely of what it cost. "I'm not here to make a scene," he said. His voice was quiet enough that the people in the first 3 rows could hear it, and no one beyond that could. "I'm not here to fight anyone." He was speaking to the room technically. He was speaking to her. "I'm here to ask one question," he said, "and then I'll leave if that's the answer." Nathan said, his voice now carrying the full weight of 2 years of practiced authority. "I don't know who you think you are, but I will have you removed from." "Nathan," Emily said at once, flat, just his name. He stopped. The room was watching. Vincent was watching. She looked at Nathan's face fully, clearly, with nothing between her perception and what she was seeing, and she thought about the text. "Smile today, or your father's company disappears tomorrow." She thought about the letter from her father's company that would arrive on Monday if she walked out of here with Nathan, and the Tuesday after that, and every leveraged moment of the future mapped out for her by a man who had decided 2 years ago that she was a useful object in an arrangement she had not consented to. She thought about Vincent standing in a parking structure 7 years ago, facing a choice she hadn't known about that had wrecked everything she'd believed that he had made without her because he'd thought he was protecting her. She thought about what that meant. She thought about whether that was love, or whether it was something complicated that looked like love when examined from a certain angle. She thought, "I don't know yet. But I know what this is." Vincent took one step closer. "Emily," he said, and nothing else. Just her name, the same way he'd said it upstairs, as though her name was the complete sentence, and everything else was already said. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the word trust. She thought about how many times in the last 2 years she had used that word about Nathan, and how it had felt like a declaration, like a statement about the kind of woman she had decided to be. Reasonable. Grounded. Not someone who trusted invisible things. She looked at Vincent Moretti, and she felt something that was not reasonable and was not grounded and was not the kind of thing you could organize into a long-term compatibility evaluation. She felt the breath come back, not metaphorically, actually. A breath she hadn't known she'd been holding for somewhere between 2 years and 7 years, unlocked itself and moved through her, and the room was there, and Nathan was there, and her father was in the third row with his hand on her mother's arm, and Dara was 4 feet to her left, with her feet planted like she intended to stay exactly where she was for as long as necessary. Emily uncurled her fingers from Nathan's grip. She took her hands back. She said quietly to Nathan, "Whatever you're about to do, whatever phone calls, whatever contracts, do it. I'm not going to stop you." She looked at him steadily. "But I'm not doing this." Nathan's expression fractured. Just for a second. The composure cracked along a seam that had always been there, that she'd never been close enough to the fracture line to see. "You don't understand what you're walking away from," he said. The controlled voice barely controlled now. "I understand exactly what I'm walking away from," she said. She turned to Vincent. She said, "What was the question?" He looked at her. Something in him, the stillness, the composure shifted into something that was not composed at all. "Is this really your choice?" he said. She thought about it for 1 full second. She thought, not his choice, not Nathan's, not my mother's version of safety, or my father's version of the future. Mine. "Yes," she said. Vincent nodded once. He reached out and offered his hand palm up, not a command, not a rescue. An offer, something she could take or not take on her own terms. She looked at it. She looked at him. Then Emily Carter, in her $12,000 dress, with the cathedral-length train in front of 240 people, including judges and politicians, and her parents, and her oldest friend, and the man who had spent 2 years building a cage around her life. One quiet favor at a time, she took his hand, and she walked away from the altar. Nathan's voice followed her down the aisle. "This isn't over, Emily. You think you know what you're doing? You have no idea what I'm capable of." She didn't turn around. She didn't stop. She walked through the main doors of the Beaumont Estate's grand ballroom, holding Vincent Moretti's hand, and behind her, she heard 240 guests exhale simultaneously, and in the chaos of noise that followed, she heard very clearly a single voice, her father's. Robert Carter on his feet in the third row, saying to no one in particular, "Well, I suppose I have some questions." And then the doors closed behind her, and the sound of the helicopter grew louder, and Nathan's voice fell away, and she walked forward into everything she didn't know yet. Which was, she thought, considerably better than the alternative. Outside, his security team was moving. His phone was already at his ear. And from somewhere across the estate, a second team of vehicles not Nathan's was pulling through the rear gate. Emily glanced up at Vincent. "You said a few hours," she said, "for the plan." "The plan is already running," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means that the federal wire I helped authorize 14 months ago finished its final verification 2 hours before your wedding." He looked at her. "Nathan's partners are being contacted right now. His accounts are frozen as of an hour ago." She stopped walking. She stared at him. "You've been working with the federal investigation. My security firm provided the technical infrastructure for the evidence collection," he said. "Legally, documented." He met her eyes. "I told you I'd built something legal." "You didn't say that legal." "I wasn't ready to tell you everything upstairs." She stared at him for a long moment. She thought about what that meant. 7 years. A destroyed syndicate. A legal security empire. And then quietly, carefully from a distance, he had never closed, dismantling the man who had built a cage around the woman he'd left behind. She thought about whether that was love, or whether it was something else she didn't have a word for yet. She thought both, probably, and we're going to spend a very long time sorting it out. "Vincent," she said. "Yeah, this is still not the explanation I asked for." "I know. We're having that conversation." "I know. Soon. As soon as we're somewhere Nathan's lawyers can't access," he said, and started walking again. She fell into step beside him. Behind them, in the grand ballroom of the Beaumont estate, the wedding she had almost married herself into was coming apart in real time, And somewhere in that unraveling, Nathan Holloway was opening his phone to find a message from his lead partner at the firm that read simply, "They have everything. We need to talk." He would read it 3 times. He would not for the first time in 15 years know what to do next. And Emily Carter would not be there to watch it. She was already gone. The morning Emily walked into the federal courthouse, she wore flat shoes. Not because she was making a statement. Not because anyone had advised her to appear relatable or accessible, or any of the other words that her attorney, a woman named Patricia Soule, who had spent 20 years taking apart men like Nathan Holloway in rooms exactly like this one, had used during their preparation sessions. She wore flat shoes because she had spent 2 years wearing heels to events where Nathan needed her to look a specific height beside him, and she was finished with that calculation. She wore what fit. She walked at her own pace. Patricia was beside her. Dara was 3 steps behind. Her father had offered to come, and she had told him gently, clearly, with the kind of directness she had been practicing for 4 months, that this was something she needed to do without him in the room. He had been quiet for a moment on the phone. Then he'd said, "All right, sweetheart, you call me when it's done." She had said she would. She had not told him that her hands were shaking. They weren't shaking because she was afraid of the room or the people in it, or what Nathan's legal team was going to attempt. They were shaking because she had spent 4 months building toward this moment, and now that it was here, the body was doing what bodies do with the release of sustained pressure, acknowledging finally that it had been under it. 4 months since the wedding. 4 months since she'd walked out of the Beaumont estate in a $12,000 dress, holding a hand she hadn't held in 7 years, and everything that had seemed catastrophic in the immediate aftermath. The press coverage, Nathan's public statement, the legal threats, the complicated weeks of explanation with her parents had resolved slowly, and then all at once into the specific clarity of a woman who knows exactly what she's doing and why. Patricia pushed through the courthouse door first. Emily followed her in. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected. She had built it larger in her mind over the preceding weeks, a grand, intimidating space designed to reduce the people inside it. The actual room was functional, institutional, with the particular acoustic quality of spaces where consequential things happen without theatrical accompaniment. She was glad it was small. Small meant she could see Nathan's face clearly from across the room. I was already seated at the opposing table with 3 attorneys arranged around him like a formation. He was wearing the charcoal suit, not the same one from the wedding, but the same category of suit, the same careful projection of authority that had always been his primary instrument. His hair was the same. His posture was the same. His eyes when they found her across the room were not the same. They had been working on something for 4 months. The composure was still present, still professionally maintained. But underneath it, she could see what 4 months of federal investigation account, freezes a suspended law license, and the systematic collapse of a carefully constructed public narrative had done to the certainty that had always lived behind his eyes. It had not destroyed the certainty, but it had cracked it. And Nathan Holloway, she had come to understand, was a man who had never before operated with cracks. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. She didn't look away first. Patricia had told her during their 3rd preparation session that the evidence package they had assembled was not merely strong, it was in Patricia's precise language, the kind of thing that makes defense attorneys call their clients at 11 o'clock at night and have very difficult conversations. The package had taken 4 months to finalize, but its foundations had been in place for over a year. Vincent's security firm had provided the technical infrastructure. The federal investigation had been running parallel with its own independent chain of evidence. What Emily had contributed, and this was the part that Nathan's attorneys had not anticipated, the part that had caused, according to Patricia's contacts, at least one of those late-night phone calls, was the witness coordination. She had found them herself, not Vincent, not the federal investigators. Emily working with Patricia and a forensic accountant named Marcus Webb, who had been untangling Nathan's firm's financial structures since the investigation began, had spent 3 months identifying the individuals who had direct knowledge of Nathan's coercive practices, people whose businesses, careers, or reputations had been leveraged. The same way her father's had been, the same way Dara's had been, the same way her mother's charity had been. People who had been silent because they were isolated, because they hadn't known anyone else existed, because Nathan's methodology had always depended on each person believing they were the only one. She had contacted 14 people. 11 had agreed to speak. She had sat across from each of them in coffee shops, in offices in one case, in a woman's kitchen, while her kids were at school, and she had listened to what had happened to them. She had not led with her own story. She asked questions and taken notes and let them talk until they were finished. She had understood in those conversations something she hadn't been able to articulate before, that Nathan's power had always depended on silence, operating at scale. Individually, each person had felt alone in something too complicated and too dangerous to challenge. Together they were 11 people, with 11 clear stories that formed one coherent pattern. A pattern. Patricia had said that was prosecutorial gold. Emily had driven home after the last of those meetings, sat in her car for 10 minutes, and cried. Not from grief specifically. From the particular exhaustion of understanding something fully. From the weight of 11 stories that she had carried home with her, and that had not gotten lighter by being known only more important. Then she had wiped her face, gone inside, and written up her notes. The hearing opened at 9:15. Patricia spoke first, and she was exactly what 20 years of exactly this work produced: precise, unadorned, moving through the evidence, with the confidence of someone who has checked every number and can account for every variable. She presented the financial documentation in chronological order. She presented the wire transfer records. She presented the shell company structures. She presented with particular clarity the pattern of coercive leverage, the contracts, the filings, the lease interventions laid out across 7 years and cross-referenced against Nathan's client list and billing records. Nathan's lead attorney objected 4 times in the first hour. 3 of the objections were overruled. The 4th was sustained on a procedural technicality that altered nothing about the substance. Emily watched Nathan's face through all of it. She watched the moment 2 hours in when his attorney leaned over and said something quiet, and Nathan's expression did the thing she had seen on the day of the wedding, the fracture along a seam that had always been there. He covered it within 2 seconds, but she saw it. She thought, there it is. She thought, that's the thing you spent 15 years making sure no one in that room ever saw. She thought, I see it now. At 11:40, Patricia called Emily to speak. She had prepared for this. She and Patricia had spent 3 sessions on exactly what she would say, how she would say it, what the legal and strategic parameters were. She was not there to testify about her feelings. She was there to provide a clear, specific, documented account of the coercive conduct she had directly experienced in the timeline that the evidence supported. She was not nervous about the facts. She knew the facts. She was briefly intensely nervous about being in the room with Nathan while she said them. She sat down. She looked at the space in front of her, and she organized herself, and she thought about her flat shoes, and she thought about Dara in the row behind her, and she thought about her father's voice on the phone saying, "You call me when it's done." Nathan's attorney stood immediately. "Ms. Carter." "It's still Ms. Carter," she said calmly. "Yes." A pause. "Ms. Carter, you've had a personal and clearly contentious relationship with my client." "That's accurate," she said. "We were engaged. He texted me a financial threat on the morning of our wedding. I have the screenshot and the metadata. It's in your package as Exhibit F." Another pause. Patricia did not visibly smile. She was too professional for that. But something in her posture adjusted by approximately 2 degrees. "The relationship between you and Mr. Vincent Moretti is not what's under examination here," Emily said. "Unless you'd like to introduce the question of whether Mr. Moretti's licensed security firm, which provided technical infrastructure to a federal investigation through entirely legal and documented means, is somehow relevant to whether your client used financial leverage to coerce 11 separate individuals over 7 years. In which case, I think the room would find that a very interesting direction." Nathan's attorney looked at his client. Nathan said nothing. His attorney said after a moment, "No further questions at this time." Emily returned to her seat. Dara reached forward from the row behind and pressed her fingers briefly against Emily's shoulder. Just once. Just enough. The hearing ran until 2:15 in the afternoon, when it ended not with a verdict that would come in stages through the formal process that Patricia had already mapped out for the weeks ahead. It ended with Nathan's lead attorney requesting a recess and spending 40 minutes in a side room with his client. When they emerged, Nathan's attorney asked to address the presiding officer. He used the word cooperation. Emily heard it from across the room and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was still held. Not satisfaction exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter than either. The feeling of a door closing correctly the way doors are supposed to close fully with the latch engaged. Patricia leaned over and said very quietly, "That's the beginning of a plea conversation." "How long?" Emily asked. "Weeks, maybe less." She paused. "He's not going to fight this in court, Emily. He would lose too publicly." Emily thought about publicly. She thought about the narrative Nathan had been building for 4 months. The op-eds in 2 publications. The statements through his PR firm. The framing of her as an unstable woman who had been manipulated by organized crime, who had destroyed a good man's reputation through manufactured accusation. She thought about the people who had believed that, or half believed it, or hadn't been sure what to believe, because Nathan Holloway had spent 15 years building relationships with exactly the people who shaped public perception. She thought about the 11 people who had sat across from her in coffee shops and kitchens and offices and told her their stories. She thought, he can call it whatever he wants. The evidence doesn't care what he calls it. She said, "Good." Outside the courthouse. The afternoon was bright. Dara was beside her. Patricia was on her phone. The small team that had assembled around this process. Marcus Webb, the forensic accountant, 2 of Patricia's associates, a paralegal named Simone, who had worked 18-hour days for 6 weeks on the document organization, was dispersing with the particular energy of people who have been collectively under pressure and have just felt at ease. Emily stood on the courthouse steps and called her father. He picked up on the second ring. "How'd it go?" he said. "It went," she said. "Patricia thinks they're moving toward a plea." A pause. She heard him breathe. "And your mother's foundation filing." "The review is complete. The non-profit status was confirmed last month, Dad. I told you." "I know you told me. I just—" Another pause. "I needed to hear it again." She understood. He'd needed to hear a lot of things again over the past 4 months. He had been in the weeks after the wedding, a man processing the discovery that his company's stability had been used as a lever by someone he had trusted, and Robert Carter did not process quietly. He processed through questions. He asked the same questions multiple times from different angles until he had satisfied himself that he understood the full shape of the thing. She had answered every question. She had been patient in a way she hadn't known she was capable of being, and she thought it was probably because she had spent 4 months asking other people questions and sitting with their answers, and the practice had changed something about how she listened. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. It's over. Or it's the beginning of over. It's going to take a few more months for the legal process, but the shape of it is done." I was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should have seen it. 2 years he was—" "You didn't know," she said. "I didn't know either. That was the point." "You figured it out." "I had help." A pause. A different kind of pause. The pause of a father navigating something he hadn't yet decided how to discuss. "Vincent Moretti," he said. "Yes." "I've been thinking about that." "I know you have. He worked for me," her father said. 23 years old, and I thought he was a good kid who made a bad choice, leaving like that." "He didn't make a bad choice, Dad. He made a terrible choice in a terrible situation, and he was 23, and he was trying to protect us, and it went wrong in ways he couldn't have predicted." She paused. "I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying I understand it." "Do you?" She thought about that. The honest answer was that she was still building her understanding, that understanding Vincent's choice 7 years ago was not the same as having processed all of it, and she wasn't someone who was going to pretend the processing was complete when it wasn't. "Enough," she said. "I understand enough." Her father was quiet. Then unexpectedly he said, "Your mother wants to have him to dinner." Emily almost laughed. "Tell her to give me a month," she said. It's still early." "I'll tell her 6 weeks," her father said. "She won't wait a month." The first thing Emily had done in the week after the wedding was move. Not dramatically. Not far. She had an apartment her own in her own name that she had signed a lease on with money from her savings account. And without consulting anyone in a neighborhood, she had chosen because she liked it, not because it was appropriate for a certain kind of life. It was smaller than the place she'd shared with Nathan. The ceilings were lower. The windows looked out on a courtyard instead of a private garden. She liked it with a ferocity that surprised her. She had spent the first week unpacking, and the second week sitting in the quiet, and the third week starting to understand what it felt like to inhabit a space that was entirely hers, where every object in every room was there, because she'd put it there, where the silence was her silence, where no one was going to appear in the doorway and explain what impression this space was creating. Vincent had not come to the apartment. She had not invited him, and he had not appeared. He had understood without being told, or perhaps he had been told in some of the conversations they'd had in the weeks after the wedding. Conversations that had been long and specific, and had covered the ground of 7 years without resolution, because resolution wasn't the point of those conversations. Honesty was the point. Saying the specific thing accurately, and then sitting with the other person while they sat with it. She had told him, "You made a decision about my life without asking me. You made it from love, I believe that now, but you made it without me. And then you spent 7 years making decisions adjacent to my life, still without me." He had said yes. She had said, "That's not going to happen again." He had said, "No, it's not." She had said, "I need you to understand why. Not because I don't trust your intentions. Because the decisions about my life are mine, not yours, not my mother's, not Nathan's, mine." He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had said, "I understand that. And Emily, I'm not sure I understood it when I was 23, but I understand it now." She had believed him. She believed him not because she needed to believe him, not because it was easier to believe him than to keep examining it, but because she had spent 4 months watching him operate in the context of the investigation, and what she had observed was consistent. He had provided resources. He had provided information. He had made things available that she and Patricia had then used according to their own judgment. He had not directed. He had not overridden. When she had made decisions he thought were strategically suboptimal, he had said so once and then accepted her answer. Once, not twice. That was new. Or it was new in her experience of him. Maybe it was something he had learned in 7 years, or maybe she was seeing a part of him that had always been there, and that she hadn't had the context to recognize at 22. She was still figuring out the difference. 3 weeks after the courthouse hearing, Nathan Holloway's law license was formally suspended pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. His Bar Association membership was placed under review. 2 of his former partners had already separated from the firm and issued individual statements that Patricia described as covering their own exposure, which meant they were not exonerating Nathan, so much as drawing a very clear line between his conduct and their own. The plea negotiations, as Patricia had predicted, moved quickly. On a Wednesday afternoon, Emily was in her apartment with Marcus Webb going over the final documentation for the charitable organizations that had been affected by Nathan's leverage structures. Her mother's foundation had been the immediate priority, but there were 2 others they'd identified through the witness coordination process, and Emily had taken on the task of connecting those organizations with the appropriate legal resources to restore their status when Patricia called. "He's taking the plea," Patricia said. Emily set down her pen. Marcus looked up. "Terms?" Emily asked. Patricia went through them. The disbarment was permanent. The criminal conviction would carry a sentence with a suspended portion contingent on restitution to the individuals affected by the coercive financial conduct. The restitution figure was significant. The public record of the conviction was permanent. His political career, Patricia said, is finished. Emily thought about what that meant to him. She had spent enough time understanding Nathan Holloway to know that the law license and the political career were not separate from his identity. They were the structure through which he understood himself. Removing them was not punishment that existed alongside him. It was a reconfiguration of what he was. She wasn't sure she felt satisfaction about that. She felt something quieter. The same thing she'd felt when his attorney said cooperation in the hearing room. A door closing correctly. "Thank you, Patricia," she said. "You did the work," Patricia said. "The 11 witnesses were the case. You found them." After they hung up, Marcus closed his laptop and looked at her. "How are you?" he asked. He'd started asking this in the last few weeks, not as a pleasantry, as an actual question from a man who had spent 6 weeks watching her build something under considerable pressure. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I think I'm okay. I think I need a few days to find out." He nodded. "That seems right," he said. She told Vincent that evening. She called him, which was still the primary mode of their contact. They met occasionally in neutral spaces, coffee shops, and a restaurant he'd chosen, because it was nothing like anything he'd ever described to her, which she thought was probably deliberate, and his voice when he picked up was the same as it always was. Present. Not performing anything. "It's done," she said. A pause. "Plea. Permanent disbarment. Restitution. Criminal conviction on record." Howe was quiet for a moment. She heard him exhale, not dramatically, not with release, just a breath that acknowledged something. "Emily," he said. "Yeah. Are you all right?" She thought about this question. She thought about all the versions of the answer she could give: the capable version, the composed version, the version that communicated she had processed this cleanly and was moving forward with appropriate momentum. She thought about what he'd said months ago in the hardest of their long conversations: "I want to know the actual answer. Not the answer you think is okay to give." "I'm tired," she said. "I'm very tired, and I'm relieved, and I'm something else that I don't have a name for yet. Some combination of things." "That sounds right," he said. "I'm also," she said, "starting to figure out what I want to do next, which I haven't really had space to think about until today." "What does that look like?" he asked. "What you want to do next?" She had been thinking about it for weeks. Since the witness coordination, actually since sitting in that kitchen with a woman who'd had her small marketing business leveraged into near closure, and listening to her describe trying to find resources for other women in similar situations, and realizing that the resources she was describing were thin on the ground, underfunded, and hard to find. She told him. She told him about the foundation idea, not a legal advocacy organization, not a shelter, something different. A resource structure for women navigating financial coercion and emotional manipulation in relationships with significant power differentials. Information. Legal referrals. Connection to the kind of witnesses who became advocates that she had found in the months of preparation. A place where the first thing anyone encountered was not judgment about why they'd stayed or why they hadn't seen it sooner, but simply, "Here is information, here is support, here is someone who has been where you are." She talked for longer than she'd planned. When she stopped, Vincent said, "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since the kitchen meeting," she said. "The one in Metairie, the woman with the marketing business." "Tell me about it," he said. She did. She told him about the woman. Her name was Renee. She was 44. She had 3 children and an ex-husband who had systematically undermined her business credit to make her financially dependent, and about the conversation they'd had, and about the way Renee had said at the end, "I just didn't know there was a word for it. I thought it was just my life." She stopped. "There should be more words for it," she said, "and more places to find them." Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need to build it?" She thought about the question. She thought about the fact that he'd asked what she needed rather than what he could do, and the distinction which she would have missed 2 years ago was not small. "I have some ideas," she said. "I want to do it right. I want it to be built right. You told me once that's how you think about things you want to last." A pause. A longer one. "I said that when I was 22. You said it on a Tuesday afternoon in a site office when I was dropping off papers for my father and you were reading a structural engineering textbook on your lunch break." Another pause. "You remember that," he said quietly. "I remember everything about that afternoon," she said. "You told me you wanted to build something that felt permanent. I thought you meant the restaurant." "I did mean the restaurant," he said. "Also other things. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Help me build this. Not run it, not direct it, not make decisions about it. Help me build it." "How?" "I don't know exactly yet. I'll figure that out. When I know what I need, I'll ask." He said, "Okay, just that. Not anything you need, not whatever I can do, not the over-offer that she had spent 2 years hearing from Nathan in contexts where the offer was always also a debt. Just okay." She thought, "That's how I know you're learning too." The foundation took 6 months to establish properly. Patricia helped with the legal structuring. Marcus consulted on the financial framework. Renee from Metairie became the first person Emily called when the board structure was being assembled, and she said yes before Emily finished the sentence. 7 of the 11 witnesses she'd coordinated had some form of ongoing involvement by the time the foundation's initial operations launched, some as advisors, some as peer supporters, some simply as people whose experience had shaped the resource design. Emily named it the Open Door Foundation. Not for elegance, for accuracy. The door was the thing, the information that let you know the door was there. She was its director. She hired a small staff. She worked long hours in ways that did not feel like the long hours she had spent organizing seating charts for someone else's ambition. They felt like the hours she spent in that site office on Tuesday afternoons, the hours that went fast because the work was actually hers. Her mother called 3 months in to say that the Carter Family Foundation wanted to make a donation. Emily almost said no out of reflex. Then she thought about it for a moment. "Tell Dad thank you," she said, "and tell him I'll take the call directly. I want to talk to him about the parameters." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've changed." Emily thought about whether that was true. "I've clarified," she said. "I think I've always been this person. I just got confused about the directions for a while." Her mother laughed, surprise genuine. "Your grandmother used to say something like that." "I know," Emily said. "She said it to me. I was 14. I didn't understand it yet." The evening that Vincent finally asked his question, it was not dramatic. It was a Wednesday evening in late October, and they were walking along the Mississippi River Promenade the way they'd started doing occasionally on evenings when Emily's schedule and Vincent's schedule intersected, which was not every week, and sometimes not every 2 weeks, because they had both built lives with actual content in them, and fitting those lives together was a project being approached carefully by 2 people who understood now what happened when things were rushed toward a shape before they were ready to hold it. She was talking about a meeting she'd had with a family court judge who was considering adding the foundation's resource list to the materials distributed in the court system. Vincent was listening the way he listened to things that were actually about her life, fully tracking specifics, asking a question when something was unclear. He asked a question. She answered it. They walked. Then he said without breaking stride, without building toward it, "Can I start over?" She looked at him. He looked back. "With you," he said. "Not from 7 years ago. Not from the wedding. From now. As the people we actually are now." He paused. "I know that's not simple. I know we're still sorting through things. I know I made choices that caused damage that doesn't disappear because I understand it differently now." She kept walking. He matched her pace. "I know," he continued, "that you don't owe me anything. You don't owe me your future because of what I did in the past, even when what I did was trying to protect you. You've made that clear, and you were right to make it clear, and I've tried to actually hear it, not just say I heard it." She thought about the past year. She thought about everything she had built in the past year. The foundation, the apartment, the specific kind of tiredness that comes from doing the right thing over a long time. She thought about 11 people in coffee shops and kitchens and offices, and the word Renee had used "just my life." She thought about her flat shoes on the courthouse steps. She thought about her father saying, "You call me when it's done," and meaning it. She thought about the site office on a Tuesday afternoon and a structural engineering textbook and the conversation that had lasted 45 minutes before her father found them. She thought about what start over meant actually. Not the romance of the phrase. The reality of it. 2 people with full histories and real damage and genuine understanding of what the other person was capable of, and not capable of choosing to build something with their eyes open. She thought that's actually the best possible version. "This time," she said, "don't disappear." He looked at her. "Never again," he said. She believed him. Not because she needed to, not because it was simpler to believe than to keep examining, but because she had watched him for a year, and the evidence was consistent, and she had learned over the course of the most consequential year of her adult life to trust the evidence more than the fear. She took his hand, not because he'd offered it, because she wanted to. They walked forward along the river, and the city moved around them with all its ordinary October noise, and Emily Carter thought about Renee, and about the 11 people, and about the foundation, and about the word permanent, and about the difference between protection that arrives without consent and love that actually sees the person it's trying to reach. She thought about everything she had built this year from the ground up, from her own judgment, in her own name. She thought about what it felt like to live in a life that was actually hers. She tightened her grip on his hand. He tightened his. And they walked forward together, not because one had saved the other, not because the past had been resolved into something clean and simple, but because they had both finally chosen honesty over fear, and that was the only foundation that had ever held anything worth keeping. That was enough. That was everything. That was exactly where the story ended, and exactly where their life began.